I'm the type of person who prefers simple routines. Maybe that's why I took the job at Mammoth Mountain Hotel. Working as a night receptionist seemed perfect. Quiet nights, no bosses breathing down my neck, and most importantly, the chance to escape the noise of the city and my own failures. I needed silence, even if it came wrapped in loneliness. The hotel was everything I expected and a little more. Isolated at the top of a mountain, it looked like a survivor from another era. Built in the 1920s, it had that faded grandeur, dark wooden walls, thick carpets that muffled footsteps, chandeliers that swayed gently when the wind blew hard outside. At first glance, it seemed like just an old hotel, but there was something in the air that made the back of my neck tense. My first night began with a tour from the manager, Mr. Halverson, a thin, middle-aged man with glasses that seemed too big for his face. He spoke quickly, looking like he couldn't wait to finish his shift. When he handed me the rules manual, thicker than I expected, his expression hardened. "Read this carefully, especially the last pages," he said, his tone serious in a way that didn't match. I'm not kidding, the list was strange from the start. Some rules made sense. Make sure the front door is locked after p.m., or keep the guest register up to date. Others, though, gave me a sense of unease I couldn't explain. Don't look directly into the lobby mirrors for more than 10 seconds after midnight. If you hear footsteps in the hall while you're alone, don't investigate. Never enter room 214. I thought about asking him about these instructions, but Mr. Halverson was already gathering his things, getting ready to leave. When he put on his coat, he looked at me as if he wanted to say something important, but then he stopped himself. "Good luck," he murmured before disappearing out the door. The first few minutes were normal. The hotel was almost empty. Most of the guests seemed to be already asleep. I was getting used to the deep silence, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the old wood or the wind tapping at the windows. I sat behind the desk, typing data into the computer, when I noticed the mirror. It was large, with an ornate golden frame, hanging on the wall just behind the desk. It reflected the hallway leading to the rooms, but from where I sat, it also captured my face when I looked up. Don't look directly into the lobby mirrors for more than 10 seconds after midnight, the rule echoed in my mind, and I found myself laughing quietly. It sounded so absurd, it almost felt like a prank. Shortly after midnight, I was still alone. No sounds, no movement. Just me, the computer, and the occasional gust of wind. But then, something changed. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was a feeling, like the air around me had thickened. I looked at the mirror, just out of curiosity. At first, everything seemed normal. It was just a reflection of the empty hallway behind me, the soft light of the lamps flickering faintly. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. There was nothing visible, but the reflection looked wrong. My heart started to race, and before I knew it, my eyes were fixed on the glass. 10 seconds. I knew it was 10 seconds because I started counting automatically, without thinking. When I got to 9, I turned my head quickly, like I had been slapped. I can't explain why, but my instinct screamed at me not to go past that point. I spent the rest of the night on edge, checking the security cameras, waiting for the clock to strike 6. When the sun finally came up, I left my shift with a tired mind and a tight chest, burdened by a feeling I couldn't shake. By my second night, I felt a little more comfortable at Mammoth Mountain Hotel, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. During the day, I tried not to think too much about what had happened with the mirror. I convinced myself it was just exhaustion or the natural nervousness of a new routine. Still, as I drove up the mountain, a sense of unease crept into my chest. I felt like someone about to break something fragile, even without meaning to. Once I arrived, I went straight to the desk. The rules manual was still there, open to the last page. I flipped through the instructions again, reading them more carefully this time. Don't look directly into the lobby mirrors for more than 10 seconds after midnight. If you hear footsteps in the hall while you're alone, don't investigate. Never enter room 214. If you find a guest not listed in the register, notify the manager immediately. Don't ask questions. Keep the front door locked after PM, and don't open it, no matter what you hear outside. Some rules were so specific, they almost seemed designed to frighten. Others were vague enough to leave room for the imagination to create even worse scenarios. I was focused on this when the phone at the desk rang. The sound was so sudden that I jumped. I picked up the receiver, adjusting my voice to sound calm. Mammoth Mountain Hotel reception. Silence. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped, but then I heard something, heavy and even breathing, like someone trying to hold back tears. "Hello," I insisted, my chest tightening. The breathing continued, now closer, like the person was right beside me. My eyes instinctively went to the mirror behind the desk, but I turned away before I could see anything. The call ended with a click. There was no one registered in the hotel who seemed to need help, at least not as far as I knew. I went back to the manual. One detail had gone unnoticed. The rules weren't numbered consecutively. Between some instructions, there were gaps like something had been left out. For example, Rule 4 instructed me to report and registered guests, but after that, the next rule was number 7. 7. If you find the hallway lights flickering, stand still and breathe slowly until they return to normal. Something was missing. And as part of me already knew, it was these gaps that were the most terrifying. Around 2 in the morning, I felt hungry and went to the staff kitchen for some coffee and a snack. It was a simple space with an old coffee maker and a fridge that creaked every time it was opened. I grabbed a sandwich and was about to take the first bite when I heard it. Footsteps. In the hallway that connected the reception to the kitchen. I knew I was alone. At least, that's what the records showed. No guests were staying in the rooms on that side of the building. Still, the footsteps were clear and slow, echoing on the wooden floor. My mind went straight to rule number 2. If you hear footsteps in the hall while you're alone, don't investigate. Dropping everything and running seemed like an option, but my feet wouldn't move. Instead, I stayed still, forcing my body to pretend nothing was happening. I counted the steps. 5, 6, 7, and then silence. When I finally mustered the courage to peek, the hallway was empty. But something was different. One of the paintings on the wall, a black and white landscape of mountains, was crooked. That night, I finished my shift like a machine, focused only on getting through the required tasks. I scanned forms, reviewed the schedule, checked the camera system without really watching anything. I did everything to avoid thinking. But Mammoth Mountain Hotel didn't let anyone forget. At the end of my shift, while waiting for the sun to rise, one detail caught my attention. On the desk, next to the phone, was something I knew hadn't been there before, an old keychain with 214 engraved on the worn metal. I looked around, hoping someone had left it there by mistake, but the reception was as empty as it should have been. I picked up the keychain carefully, feeling its weight in the palm of my hand. I shouldn't have entered that room, but the hotel seemed to have other ideas. The number on the keychain seemed to glow under the dim light of the desk, as if it wanted to be noticed. I wondered why, of all things, it was room 214 that insisted on finding me. The rule book had been clear: never enter room 214. But the more I stared at the keychain, the harder it was to ignore its pull. I left the object on the desk and convinced myself it wasn't my business. Maybe some guest had lost the key years ago, or maybe the room was just a closed-off, dusty part of the hotel. I spent the next few minutes reorganizing papers and tweaking trivial details in the system, trying to push the number from my mind. But the questions kept coming like a river, an unstoppable current. Why was there such a specific rule about that room? And who had left the keychain there? As I fought the temptation, the wind outside picked up, whistling through the corners of the windows as if mocking my hesitation. I looked at the clock. It was a.m. It was always around this time that the mind started playing tricks, dredging up old fears and thoughts I usually kept buried. For a while, nothing happened. The hotel was completely silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old wood. But then, the lights in the hallway began to flicker. At first, it was just a quick blink, almost imperceptible. Then longer. I took a deep breath and stood still, exactly like the rule said. It felt like being in the middle of a storm, waiting for the thunder after the lightning. The world seemed frozen in time. When the lights finally steadied, I felt a relief that was immediately replaced by another feeling, dread. The keychain was no longer on the desk. I knew I hadn't touched it, but it was gone. A chill ran down my spine as I searched the area for a logical explanation. There was none. It wasn't until I returned to the desk that I noticed something strange on the computer screen. The registration system was open, but someone had typed a message in the general notes field. 214, you need to see. My heart hammered in my chest. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Maybe it was a prank something Mr. Halverson or another staff member had programmed to scare rookies like me. Yeah, that had to be it. But what if it wasn't? When I finally decided to leave the desk, I noticed I was holding a flashlight. I didn't remember picking it up. Maybe my body had already made the decision before I admitted it to myself. The hallway leading to room 214 was longer than I remembered, with shadows deeper than usual. It was as if the light there was being swallowed, leaving behind a thick, alive darkness. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than it should. I reached the door with a dry throat and sweaty hands. The number 214 was engraved on a golden plaque that looked newer than the rest of the hotel. The doorknob, however, was old and worn, as if it had been used thousands of times. I paused for a moment, listening to the silence around me. It was strange because I was sure I could hear something behind the door. A low, uneven sound, like someone dragging their feet on the floor. I shouldn't be here. Everything inside me screamed to turn back. But curiosity is a strange burden. It pushes us to places we know will hurt us. I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open with an agonizing sound, revealing a room that seemed lost in time. The furniture was luxurious, but covered in dust and stains. There was a 4-poster bed with torn sheets and a large mirror in the corner, so dusty it barely reflected anything. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, standing with its back to me, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or some forgotten decorative statue. But whatever it was, it started moving, slowly, as if it had realized it wasn't alone anymore. I didn't wait to find out more. I slammed the door shut and ran back to the desk, my heart beating so fast it felt like it was going to explode. When I finally sat down, my hands shaking, I realized the keychain was back on the desk. I should have never opened that door. After the experience in room 214, I did everything I could to continue the shift as if nothing had happened. I didn't go back to the hallway and avoided looking at the keychain on the desk. It was as if ignoring its presence could lessen the weight of what had happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rest of the night dragged on slowly. The sound of the wind outside seemed louder than before, banging against the windows and making the walls creak. Every little noise seemed amplified. Each would creak or clock tick, putting me on edge. Around a.m., the phone rang again. That shrill sound, breaking the silence, made me jump out of my chair. I reluctantly picked up the receiver. Mammoth Mountain Hotel reception. Once again, silence. Hello. My voice sounded more hesitant than I wanted. This time, the response came. A low, raspy voice, almost a whisper. You shouldn't have entered the room. My blood ran cold. Who's this? I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The line went dead, but the silence felt heavy, as if the person was still there. I didn't hear the usual sound of a call being disconnected. I hung up before I could hear anything else. I went back to the desk and grabbed the rule book again. There was nothing in there about what to do in case of strange calls. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was testing me, pulling me deeper and deeper. Around a.m., as the sky began to lighten, I decided to check the security cameras to distract myself. There were small black and white monitors showing images from different areas of the hotel: the lobby, the hallways, the main entrance, and some outdoor areas. Most of the screens showed what I expected: nothing but empty hallways and shadows cast by trees outside. But when I looked at the camera pointed at the second-floor hallway, the one where room 214 was, I saw something that made me catch my breath. The door to the room was open. She shouldn't have been there. I was sure I'd locked the door tight before I left. In the grainy image, all I could see was a thick darkness beyond the open door. There was no movement, but just the fact that the door was like that was enough to freeze me in place. As I stared at the screen, something changed. A shadow appeared at the edge of the frame, on the opposite side of the room. It wasn't a person, at least. It didn't look like one. It was more like a blotch of darkness, blurred and misshapen, slowly moving down the hallway. I turned off the monitor. I didn't want to know any more. The first light of day finally started creeping through the lobby windows, and with it came a faint sense of relief. My shift was almost over. I grabbed my coat and was about to leave when I heard a noise from the hallway behind me. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like nails scratching wood. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty hallway. But when I looked closer, I noticed something on the floor just below where the hallway connected to the lobby. An envelope. I walked over to it with hesitant steps. My whole body protested at the idea of touching the object, but my curiosity, as always, was stronger. The envelope was old, made of thick, yellowed paper. It had no sender or recipient, just the number 214 scribbled on the front in shaky handwriting. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. The message was short, but its impact hit me like a punch to the stomach. There's still time to leave. I looked around, searching for any sign of who might have left it there. But as always, the lobby was empty. I tucked the envelope into my pocket, promising myself I'd give it to the manager the next night. But deep down, I already knew. He wouldn't have any answers for what was happening. The next night, I returned to work with a knot in my stomach. The day had passed in a fog, my mind replaying every detail of the previous shift. The envelope was safely tucked away in the drawer of my nightstand, but I didn't have the courage to open it again. When I got to the hotel, I found Mr. Halverson waiting in the lobby, an exhausted look on his face. "Had a tough night yesterday?" he asked, his tone almost casual. I thought about telling him about room 214, the shadow on the camera, and the envelope. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something he already knew. I didn't ask how, but it was clear Halverson didn't need any explanations. It was strange, that's all, I murmured, looking away. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer. Then he left something on the counter, another envelope, just as yellowed as the one I'd received before. "Read this before you start," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of sympathy. "It'll help." Before I could respond, he was gone, disappearing through the entrance doors like a shadow fading in the dim light of the parking lot. I picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it, finding a sheet of paper with more rules. Some were repeats, like, "Don't enter room 214 and don't look out the window after 3 a.m. But others were new. "If the phone rings 3 times in a row, don't answer it. "If you hear footsteps behind you, stay still. Don't turn around. "If someone asks to use the elevator, say it's out of service." New rules, new dangers. My heart tightened. What the hell was going on in this place? I stopped asking myself questions when the clock struck midnight. It was time to start the shift. The first few hours were calm, almost too calm. The hallways seemed darker than usual, and the lobby was swallowed by an oppressive silence. I kept busy with my usual tasks, organizing reservations, checking the inventory, but my mind was on constant alert, waiting for the next strange event. Around a.m., the phone rang. Once, then again, and again. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, fighting the urge to pick up the receiver. The rule was clear. Don't answer if the phone rings 3 times in a row. The ringing stopped, leaving a heavy silence in the air. I walked over to the coffee machine, trying to shake off the chill running down my spine. But before I could calm myself, something happened. The mirror behind the counter reflected something that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing in the second-floor hallway, next to the staircase. I turned immediately, but the hallway was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was still there. It wasn't a person. Or, if it was, it didn't move like one. The shape was tall and hunched, with limbs too long and thin to be human. It stood still, but the way it looked at me even without visible eyes made me want to run. I closed my eyes and forced myself to remember the rules. If you hear footsteps behind you, stay still. Don't turn around, but they didn't say anything about mirrors. I took a deep breath and did what seemed like the only sensible thing. I left the counter and went to the staff area where the mirror couldn't reach me. Things got worse around a.m. I was in the supply room, trying to control my breathing, when I heard something coming from the main hallway. Footsteps, slow and dragging, like someone walking barefoot on a cold floor. I remembered the rule about footsteps. Stay still. Don't turn around. But this time, the footsteps were going the wrong way. They weren't behind me. They were coming straight toward me. The supply room door was closed, but not locked. And as I listened to the footsteps draw closer, a terrible thought formed in my mind. It wasn't going to stop. I gripped the doorknob tightly, trying to keep it from moving. When the footsteps finally stopped, right on the other side of the door, my heart nearly leaped out of my chest. There was a moment of absolute silence, followed by a sound that froze me, heavy, irregular breathing, like something was waiting for me to open the door. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, praying for it to go away. And then came the voice. Open the door. It was a whisper, but there was something in it that made me want to obey. Something almost hypnotic. I didn't move. Open the door, the voice repeated, louder now, almost desperate. I stayed there for more than 10 minutes, until the breathing stopped and the footsteps faded away. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, the hallway was empty. But on the floor, right in front of the door, was another envelope. As soon as I grabbed the envelope, I felt a chill run up my spine. It was identical to the previous one's, yellowed, with a rough texture almost like dried skin. This time, there was no number written on the front. Just my name, Evan. I looked around. The hallway was empty, but the silence was thick, as if the very air was holding its breath. I returned to the counter, sitting in the swivel chair with the envelope tightly between my fingers. I opened it carefully. Inside, there was only a small piece of paper with a single sentence written in hurried handwriting. The elevator is never empty. There was no signature, no further explanation. The warning stayed etched in my mind as I read and reread the words. For a moment, I thought about tearing up the paper, but something inside me, maybe fear, maybe instinct, told me to keep it. I folded the note and tucked it into my uniform pocket, trying to convince myself that it didn't mean anything. Just another piece of the insane puzzle that was working at the Mammoth Mountain Hotel. About half an hour later, the phone rang. Just once. I picked up the receiver, trying to stay calm. Mammoth Mountain Hotel reception. The elevator stopped on the 3rd floor. The voice on the other end was male, but with a strange, almost metallic tone. "Who's speaking?" I asked. Silence. "Hello?" I insisted. Before I could get a response, the call dropped. I checked the security monitor. The camera showing the elevator only showed the closed door, nothing out of the ordinary. But the unease didn't subside. Shortly after 3 in the morning, I heard the familiar sound, the mechanical clink of the elevator rising. I knew the hotel was empty. There were no guests registered, and no other staff on the night shift besides me. Still, the cabin rose slowly, marking each floor with a metallic sound that seemed to echo throughout the building. When it finally stopped, I looked at the monitor. The camera pointed at the elevator entrance on the ground floor. The door creaked open slowly. There was no one inside. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. The light inside the cabin flickered faintly, and the walls reflected shadows that didn't make sense, moving in opposite directions to the light. It was like something invisible was there, shifting, waiting. I looked away from the screen, but the sound of the doors opening and closing persisted, as if the elevator was trying to get my attention. The rule book said to ignore the elevator. But after the note in the envelope, I started to wonder, what happens when the rules aren't enough? Around 3:30 a.m., I heard footsteps at the front entrance. Someone was coming from outside. I stood up, momentarily relieved, thinking it could be Mr. Halverson or even a late guest. But when I got close to the glass doors, what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a man, or at least something that resembled a man. He was wearing a black suit, but his movements were stiff, almost robotic. He stopped outside, looking directly at me. The distance kept me from seeing details of his face, but something was wrong with his posture, how he just stood there while the wind stirred his clothes. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice muffled by the glass. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one finger and pointed at the elevator. I looked in the direction he pointed, but there was nothing. When I looked back at him, the man was gone. The unease lingered until the end of my shift. Every time I passed the elevator, I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was watching me from inside the cabin. When the sun finally began to rise, the elevator made its final movement, descending to the ground floor with a loud crash. The doors opened slowly, revealing only the empty cabin. But as I looked inside, I noticed something. On the elevator floor, there were footprints. Not from shoes, but from something larger, heavier, with long fingers and claws scraping the metal. After the elevator incident, I decided I needed to be more cautious. I quickly checked the security cameras before sitting back behind the counter. The footage was normal, but that pattern of normalcy only made everything more unsettling. Around a.m., the phone rang again. This time, 3 short, sharp rings. I answered hesitantly. Mammoth Mountain Hotel, reception. There was a silence. Then a female voice came through, muffled, as if it were coming through an old radio. Room 237 needs to be cleaned. I paused, confused. We don't have any guests tonight. Must be a mistake. Room 237 needs to be cleaned. The voice repeated firmly. Before I could respond, the call dropped. I grabbed the room register to check. Nothing unusual was listed about room 237, except that it hadn't been used for months. A previous guest had complained about a strange smell, and the room had been sealed for maintenance. Despite this, something urged me to check. I climbed the narrow corridor to the 2nd floor. The hallway lights flickered weakly, and the old carpet creaked under my steps. When I reached room 237, I noticed the number plate was slightly tilted. I knocked twice. Nothing. I grabbed the doorknob and a chill ran through my skin. It felt like touching ice. I slowly turned the spare key. The door creaked open, revealing the interior of the room. Room 237 looked untouched. The bed was perfectly made. The lamp on the table was on, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something metallic. I hesitated at the entrance, leaving the door open behind me. I didn't want to be trapped in there if something went wrong. In the center of the room, on the bed, there was one object, a framed photograph. I carefully picked it up, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was an old black and white image of a group of people posing in front of the hotel. Men and women elegantly dressed, with smiles that seemed too fixed, as if they were molded onto their faces. My gaze was drawn to a figure in the back. A man in a suit blurred, as if he didn't belong in the photo. He wasn't smiling. Instead, his face was turned directly toward me, as if he knew I was looking. I placed the photo back in its place and turned to leave, but I stopped halfway. The door, which I had left open, was now completely shut. The doorknob wouldn't turn, no matter how hard I tried. I took a step back, feeling my heart race. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound coming from the bathroom. I took a deep breath and headed toward the door. It was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered. I opened the door all at once, expecting something or someone. But the bathroom was empty. Empty, except for one word written on the mirror in smudged letters, as if someone had drawn it with their finger on the foggy surface. Leave. I ran back to the main door, pounding on it desperately, trying to open it. Finally, the handle gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway, almost tripping. When I looked back, the room seemed exactly the same as before, calm, motionless, untouched. But as I descended the stairs, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. A low female laugh, echoing at the end of the hall. I hurried down the stairs, feeling adrenaline pulsing through my veins. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached the lobby. The air there felt thicker now, as if the hotel's energy was trying to swallow me whole. When I reached the front desk, I grabbed the rule book. As absurd as it seemed, it was the only thing giving me any direction in this nightmare. The pages were a bit worn, the edges yellowed, as though it had passed through many nervous hands. I sat down and flipped through the manual, looking for any mention of room 237 or the elevator. The rules were still the same, clear, direct, but with no explanations. It was as if they had been written for someone who already knew what was going on there. Then, something strange happened. As I was reading the page about the schedule, the letters started to move, like fresh ink being spread. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but no, the words were really changing. The original phrase, "after 3:30 a.m., avoid the upper floors," disappeared, replaced by something new. "Listen to the voices, but do not answer." I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if the hotel itself was aware of what I had just read. The rest of the night was uneasy. Every little sound, the creak of the heating system, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed amplified, as if something was moving in the shadows. Around a.m., I decided to review the security cameras one more time. I looked at the screen, quickly scanning the hallways and floors. Everything seemed normal until I got to the second floor. The hallway outside room 237 was empty, but the lights were flickering in a strange pattern, as if something was interfering with them. And then, in the corner of the screen, I saw a figure. It was the man in the suit. He was standing, motionless, staring directly at the camera. His face was still blurred, but I could feel his eyes on me, even through the screen. Then he started walking toward the camera, each step bringing him closer, until his figure filled the entire image. The screen went black. I turned off the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to leave, to abandon the hotel right then and there, but the feeling of being trapped was almost physical. Something told me that even if I tried, the hotel wouldn't let me go. I grabbed the manual again, this time holding it so tightly my hands were shaking. I flipped back to the same page, expecting to see the rule changed, but the previous phrase had disappeared. In its place, another message appeared. "If he finds you, it will be too late." I threw the manual on the counter, backing away as if I'd been bitten. At that moment, I heard a sound from behind me. Voices. Low, indistinct, but definitely human. I turned slowly, fear tightening my chest. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, a constant murmur filling the air. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, as if it were inside my head. Then, one word stood out among the whispers. Evan, my name. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, trying to focus on something, anything, other than that sound. The rules said not to answer, so I clung to that as if it were a lifeline. The voices continued, but I remained still, silent. Finally, they started to fade, until they disappeared completely. The silence that followed was disturbing, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was waiting. When the sun began to rise on the horizon, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But the certainty that the next shift would bring something even worse was impossible to ignore. I looked at the manual again, but the pages were empty now, as if the hotel itself had decided I already knew enough. The next night, I returned to the Mammoth Mountain Hotel with a different weight on my shoulders. It wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that sooner or later, I would fail to follow the rules. Something was testing me. When I entered the lobby, it seemed darker than usual. The lights flickered slightly, as if the place were breathing. The clock on the wall read 10:15 p.m. I had enough time to prepare, but a growing discomfort told me that tonight would be different. I grabbed the manual again, flipping through the pages carefully. The words were static now, as if mocking my search for more guidance. I closed the book with a sigh and looked at the clock again. 10:17 p.m., then it happened. A loud banging echoed through the lobby. Once, twice, 3 times, like someone pounding on the front door. I slowly stood up, hoping it was just a late guest. But the logical part of my mind knew that was unlikely. No one had checked in that week. I walked to the door and looked through the frosted glass. No one was there. The sound came again, but this time louder, as if it were a thunderclap reverberating through the building. I looked around, trying to find an explanation, but nothing seemed out of place. I remembered the rule about not opening the door after p.m. I took a deep breath and returned to the counter, trying to ignore the pounding that continued. Around p.m., the banging stopped, and I began to relax. It was then that the phone rang again. Mammoth Mountain Hotel, front desk. There was silence for a few seconds. Then, a male voice spoke, firm, but with a dry, almost mechanical tone. "You forgot to lock the door." I turned immediately, looking at the entrance. The door was closed, but I wasn't sure if I had locked it. I hung up the phone and walked over, trying not to panic. The handle turned easily. I hadn't locked it. I locked it quickly, feeling my hands sweat, and returned to the counter. But when I turned around, I saw something that froze my blood. The manual was open, and a new rule had appeared, written in irregular, hurried handwriting. "Now they can come in." I swallowed hard and looked around. The lobby seemed empty, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. The clock read midnight when the first sounds began. A faint scratching, coming from the walls like nails dragging on wood. The security cameras showed interference, the images shaking and flickering before returning. But on the main hallway monitor, something caught my attention. A shadow, tall and thin, moving slowly, disappearing into the corner of the screen. I grabbed the security radio from the counter, even though I knew no one would answer. It was a futile attempt to find some comfort. "Hello. If anyone is there, please respond." There was static for a few seconds, and then the same male voice from before responded, "You let them in." I slammed the radio onto the counter, feeling my heart race. Everything inside me screamed to leave, but my legs felt frozen. The phone rang again, but I didn't pick up. I couldn't. The sound kept going, echoing through the lobby before stopping abruptly. The lights started flickering, and the scratching on the walls grew louder, now accompanied by a low sound, almost like a growl. When I looked at the cameras again, I saw the second-floor hallway. The door to room 237 was open, swaying slightly as if someone had just passed through it. Then, in the corner of the screen, a figure appeared. It was the man in the suit again, standing still, staring directly at the camera. This time, his face wasn't blurred. He had a wide grin, with teeth that looked too sharp, and eyes empty, black as coal. He raised a hand and pointed directly at me. The image disappeared, and the lobby went completely silent. I knew I had failed. The rules were clear, and I didn't follow them. But what did "now they can enter" mean? Who were they? The clock read 12:30. I had 6.5 hours to survive, but something told me the night would be much longer than that. The night already felt too long when the clock finally hit 1 a.m. The silence in the lobby was so dense it almost seemed like a sound in itself. I was sitting behind the counter, staring at the manual. The words, "now they can enter," were still there, dancing on the edges of my vision, as if mocking me. There was no pretending I was in control. The hotel had made that clear. That's when I heard it. A click followed by another, like footsteps echoing down an empty hallway. I looked at the cameras, trying to locate the source, but they were still glitching with occasional interference. The second-floor hallway flickered in black and white, and the same door to room 237 was open. But now something was moving inside it. A shadow, slow and deliberate. It didn't seem to have a clear shape, more like a blur on the screen than anything concrete, but the way it moved made my stomach churn. It was like watching a predator approach its prey. The footsteps kept going, louder now. Then, suddenly, They stopped. The next sound was something falling. A loud thud, followed by the sound of wood scraping, as if furniture was being dragged. I grabbed the radio again, not really sure who I was trying to call for help. "Reception here. Is someone in the second floor hallway?" The response came almost immediately. "They're playing with you." It was the same voice from the previous phone call. I dropped the radio so hard it fell to the floor, sliding under the counter. There was no logic to what was happening, but the fear was real. The manual no longer had any instructions, and I knew that going up to investigate wasn't an option. That's when a light started flickering above me in the lobby. I looked up and saw the chandelier light flickering wildly. It went completely dark for a moment, leaving me in total darkness. And then I heard something. Not footsteps this time, but breathing. Slow, labored, coming directly behind me. I turned instinctively, but there was nothing there. The lobby was empty as always. But the feeling didn't go away. Something was there, even though I couldn't see it. The phone rang again, the sound cutting through the air like a siren. "Mammoth Mountain Hotel, reception," I answered, my voice trembling. This time, the silence on the other end lasted longer. For a moment, I thought the line was dead. But then, the same male voice spoke, in a tone that made me feel even smaller than I already did. "Let's play." I was going to respond, ask what he meant, but the call dropped before I could speak. The sound came back, the footsteps echoing down the second floor hallway. I looked at the cameras again and saw that the shadow was moving faster now, stopping in front of the elevator. I heard the elevator doors open, followed by a soft hiss. The cameras only showed the empty elevator, but something about the image was wrong. The reflection in the elevator mirror seemed incomplete. The doors closed, and the elevator panel showed it was going down. I held my breath as I watched the numbers on the display above the counter. 2, 1, ground floor. The doors opened slowly. There was no one there, but the tension in the air was almost unbearable. I stood up, unable to stay still, and took a step toward the elevator. But before I could get closer, I heard something that made me stop. It was the sound of a laugh. Weak, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It came from the lobby, as if someone was enjoying my misery. I went back to the counter, trying to regain control. I grabbed the manual again, flipping through the pages hastily, but they were all blank now. All of them. The rules were gone. And for the first time, I felt that the game they mentioned had no clear instructions. I looked at the clock again. It was still 1:30. Time seemed to have stopped, the next minute taking longer than it should have. That's when the lobby door began to creak, as if something was pushing it from the inside, even with the lock in place. My instincts screamed at me not to approach, but I stayed frozen, waiting for it to stop on its own. The door stopped creaking, but then the most terrifying sound of the night reached me. 3 knocks. This time, they didn't come from the outside. They came from inside the hotel. The clock read to 15, and the feeling that something was about to happen grew with every passing second. I didn't want to know what the knocks on the door meant, but I knew that if it was an attempt to get someone inside, it couldn't be ignored. Not now. Not after everything I'd already heard. Every step I took toward the door felt like a trap being set, each knock of the wood echoing in my head, as if it were a signal. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of the place, a mix of mold and a sense of wear. The walls, which during the day had seemed almost comforting, were now full of secrets I didn't want to uncover. One step after another, I moved forward. It was when I reached the lobby door that I heard another knock. Stronger, more demanding, as if the door was being challenged to open. My hand hesitated before touching the handle, the cold metal in stark contrast with the warmth of my skin. I knew something beyond the normal was about to happen, but I couldn't understand the rules of this damned place anymore. The manual was lost, and while the radio had been my only source of communication, it only brought more questions. Nothing made sense anymore. Every piece of reality I touched disintegrated before me. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that there was no turning back. The hotel door was now in front of me, and the sound coming from there was a mixture of murmurs and dragging footsteps. I no longer knew if they were the footsteps of a real person, or if my mind was finally breaking under the weight of those nights. And that's when I saw something. Something that made me take a step back. The lobby light, which had been off until then, turned on by itself. Not with the subtle flicker of a lamp trying to come back to life, but with a sudden intensity, almost as if the bulb had been taken over by some strange force. And then I saw a figure in the light of the lamp. It was someone, or something. What I saw was a silhouette, a person with an indistinct face like a smear of shadows. But the strangest thing was the way it moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something I could classify. Every movement was fluid, as if gravity had no effect. It was there, but not there. The steps didn't make sense. I turned the doorknob without thinking, almost on impulse, and suddenly opened the door. The sound of the wood creaking filled the space, and the figure disappeared as if it had been sucked into the darkness. I stepped into the lobby, the smell of mildew still lingering. The walls seemed taller, more threatening. Every picture on the walls, every piece of furniture, seemed to be watching me. The environment was unrecognizable. I knew there was something more there, something beyond my fear. The laughter returned. The same laughter as before, but louder, closer. It seemed to come from all sides at once. I looked around, but nothing was there. Suddenly, I heard the sound of something falling, a metallic clang, and then the elevator doors opened with a sharp snap. I knew I shouldn't, but something pulled me toward the elevator. I needed to see what was happening. I needed to understand. The doors closed behind me, and as if by its own will, the elevator started to descend. Every floor we passed felt like one more step into my own doom. The numbers on the display dropped slowly. 1. Basement. And when the doors opened, I understood I was no longer in the hotel. It was a different place, one that shouldn't exist, like a reflection of what the Mammoth Mountain Hotel really was. I was in what seemed like a replica of the reception, but the walls were in ruins. Dust and broken pieces of wood were scattered everywhere. The air was cold, colder than it should be, and the whispers, the murmurs, were clearer now, more urgent. There was a staircase at the back of the room, leading up to what appeared to be an upper floor, but it didn't look like part of the hotel I knew. It was a staircase that shouldn't have been there, a path calling me toward an unknown destination. I knew I shouldn't follow, but my feet betrayed me, and I began to climb. Each step seemed to take me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Shadows danced on the walls, and the whispers grew louder. When I reached the top, the environment was even more distorted. In front of me, a door stood open, as if waiting for me. A dim light emanated from there, and it was impossible not to feel something watching me. Something was waiting for me. I took a deep breath and entered. What I found on the other side was nothing like what I expected. I entered the room, and the sense of claustrophobia was instant. It felt as if the walls were closing in around me, but I couldn't go back. What was inside called to me, drawing me in a way I couldn't control. I knew the destination awaited me, and it wasn't interested in offering choices. The room seemed to be an exact replica of the hotel's office, but it was an absolute decay. What was once a space of comfort and rest was now covered in dirt and dust, and the light, that dim light coming from the center of the room, seemed to come from something hiding in the depths. I tried to look around, but something in the air made me hesitate. The walls, which once seemed solid, were now damp and wrinkled. The bulletin board was hanging sideways, its messages completely erased, as if time had stopped there. There was a desk in the center, but what drew me there wasn't the desk itself. It was what was on top of it. It was a file, or rather, a stack of them. I walked over, my steps echoing in the empty room, and looked closer. The smell was unbearable, but something pushed me to turn the page. What was written was unrecognizable. The paper was yellowed old, like a letter from a past that shouldn't be remembered. I couldn't help it. I started to read. The words were distorted, fluctuating between legible and incomprehensible. Feelings I didn't want to explore began to form in my mind, and a sense of déjà vu took over me. I was reliving something I had already experienced, something deep and terrifying. What was there wasn't just the hotel's history, it was the story of everyone who had passed through it. I felt that somehow, this was connecting me to everything that was happening. The written words were like invitations, pieces of a puzzle I couldn't understand. My heart raced, and I couldn't focus on the words anymore. I knew I was about to understand something I didn't want to know. And then I saw it. An image. Not a normal image, but an impression, like a photo with blurred edges. It was a photo of the hotel's reception, but the image was unfocused in a strange way. I looked closer and could see a man standing behind the reception. His face was partially visible, but the strangest thing was what was around him. Something that was beyond the simple unknown. Something that seemed to be there, but shouldn't be. It was a shadow. A shadow that seemed to extend beyond the photo. A shadow that was moving. I couldn't look at it anymore. I felt a growing pressure, as if something invisible was watching me. I closed my eyes, trying to push the feeling away. When I opened them again, the environment was different. The office was dirtier, more desolate, as if it was disintegrating before my eyes. Time seemed to be distorting in a way I couldn't comprehend. The clock on the wall was stopped. The sound of its broken hands made me realize there was no more time. Something was coming closer to me. Something was about to manifest, and I was trapped there, unable to move. That's when the door behind me slammed shut. The sound was so loud, it almost made me lose my balance. The room was now completely dark, except for the faint light still coming from the file on the desk. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was the feeling that there was something else in the room with me. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel. I didn't know what to do anymore. I was completely lost, without any direction, unsure of what was real or what wasn't. The hotel was no longer trying to scare me with simple things. It was trying to trap me in what I feared most. My breathing was heavy, and I could no longer see what was in front of me. But I could hear the sound of something moving slowly, almost like nails scratching wood. Something was approaching me, and the sound was getting louder. It was coming from the darkness. Something was there, and I knew I couldn't escape. Not this time. I felt the weight of it approaching me, and I couldn't resist anymore. The only thing left was to accept what was about to happen. The hotel was swallowing me, and I was inside it, more lost than ever. I took a step forward, and the room opened into a vast, dark space. I was in the depths of a nightmare, and I knew the only thing that could save me was the truth still hidden somewhere inside that damn place. I could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. The space around me seemed to move, changing shape, as if the hotel itself was breathing. I wanted to believe I was just imagining things, but the growing pressure on my chest told me that wasn't the case. There was no way back. Whatever had begun, I was in it until the end. I turned slowly, the room now so dark that I could barely see the outlines of the desk in front of me. I didn't know if the shadows were really there or if my mind had lost all perception of what was real. I just knew that the silence had become unbearable, heavy in a way that couldn't be explained. Then I heard a sound, not of something moving in the darkness, but of a voice. It was low, muffled, like a whisper coming from far away, and at the same time, it seemed so close that I could almost feel the breath of the being that spoke. "Are you ready?" The words sliced through the air, and I froze. Fear was new to me, but this was beyond anything I had ever experienced. Somehow, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. And worst of all, I knew the entity that had taken over the hotel didn't just want to scare me. It wanted to make me a part of its story. Somehow, I was already a part of it. "You'll see." We all see. The voice was clearer now, almost as if it were inside my own mind, pulsating with a feeling I couldn't shake. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was nothing but darkness. The walls were closing in again, compressing the room in a way that made me want to scream, but the words wouldn't come. An invisible weight pressed down on my throat. Then the light. A faint bluish light began to glow from some distant point. As the light grew, a shape became visible. It was humanoid, but its form was distorted, like a massive shadow taking shape. It stood in front of me, an indescribable silhouette that seemed to melt and reform with every passing second. Fear paralyzed me. I knew what it wanted. For a moment, I understood that the hotel, with its macabre history, was not just a place. It was alive, and it had chosen me. I was a part of it, like an atom lost in a massive organism, trapped in what they called destiny. "You won't leave." The voice was now so clear, I could feel the words trembling inside me. "Everyone who's entered here has stayed." I tried to move, tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And yet, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just a dream. The hotel had something else in store for me. The figure in front of me moved closer, and I could almost see details of its face, or whatever that face was. It was a deformed mass, with eyes that seemed to glow but were empty. There was no empathy, no understanding. Just an unsettling presence, making me feel that my existence was nothing more than a piece in a larger story, a story without an end. "You'll understand. Now you're one of us." I felt myself being absorbed by the darkness. My body was slowly dissolving, becoming part of the hotel. The sensation was unbearable, as if my very soul were being stretched, pulled into a place that didn't make sense. I was nothing, and at the same time everything. Whatever that place was, whatever that entity was, it was consuming me completely. The figure in front of me moved, its eyes glowing even brighter. I saw something in its hand, an object reflecting the light in a strange way. It was a key, an old key, as if it had been molded from the very bones of the hotel. I knew what it wanted. I knew that to escape, I would need to take the key, but something kept me from reaching out. There's no escape. I saw the key tremble in the air. I tried to reach for it, but the darkness enveloped me once again. It was like being pulled into a rift, into a bottomless abyss. Yet, just as the key was about to fall into my hands, something happened. Something in the air changed, and the weight of the entity withdrew for a moment. I didn't know if it was a trick or if, somehow, the key was my only chance. But I knew time was running out. I reached out. The key was closer now, but as I touched it, an indescribable sensation overtook me. I held it tightly, feeling the cold texture of the metal, but at the same time, it was as if the object were burning me. I tried to pull my hand away, but something held me there. The figure in front of me watched, and I felt its eyes, or whatever those flames in the emptiness of its face were, penetrating me deeply. It was as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. It didn't move, but its presence seemed to expand, consuming the space around me. "You don't understand. There's nowhere to go." The voice, once again, was inside my head, reverberating like a wave of despair. I knew that whatever that being was, it wasn't lying. There was no way out. I felt the weight of reality unraveling. What was left of me was a piece of flesh, something vaguely human, struggling against the inevitable. I took a deep breath, trying to push away the sensation of sinking into an endless sea. There was a strange resistance, as if a part of me still had the strength to fight. But there was another part, a darker part, that was drawn to that growing darkness. And it was then that the key began to glow. It wasn't a warm or inviting light. It was cold, sharp, emanating from deep within me. Something inside me, something that shouldn't have been there, began to awaken. I saw flashes of memories that weren't mine, of people who had been swallowed by the hotel before me. I saw their faces, their empty eyes, their expressions frozen in time. They were trapped, just as I was about to be. But there was something different, something I couldn't understand. The key broke. It split into two, and with it, a scream echoed through the room, a sound so deep it made the walls tremble. I dropped to my knees, the pain overwhelming, as if my very essence were being shattered. But as I looked at the two halves of the key, one thing became clear. The hotel was no longer in control. There was an opening, a tear in reality that I hadn't seen before. The light from the broken key illuminated the space around me, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as if a curtain were being pulled back, revealing something that had always been there, but that I had never wanted to see. The hotel wasn't a place. It was a prison that existed outside of time, beyond human comprehension. What it had done to everyone who had passed through it, to everyone who had followed the rules, now made sense. They were being consumed, transformed, part of an eternal cycle. But the key had broken that. I stood up, though my vision was blurry. The scream had stopped, but the feeling that something was about to happen consumed me from within. The hotel was writhing, changing form, trying to correct what I had done. The walls began to move, the floor twisted beneath my feet, and the shadows stretched as if they wanted to swallow me again. I looked behind me. The figure that had been in front of me was no longer there, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was still there somewhere, in the shadows, waiting, watching, waiting for my next move. I knew I couldn't go back. The key had been destroyed, but somehow it had done what needed to be done. I was free, but not from everything. The hotel was still alive, and I knew nothing would ever be the same. The rules had changed, and I was about to find out just how far this could go. The darkness ahead of me seemed inviting, but I knew the real fight was yet to come. It wouldn't be easy to leave, but with the key broken, I had no choice. And in that moment, with the sound of the wind cutting through the silence of the hotel, I took my first step into the unknown. I took the first step, but the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it were swaying between the real and the unreal. The hotel was now transforming before my eyes. Reality was unraveling, and I didn't know what was safe anymore. Every hallway I crossed seemed longer than the last, as if the space itself was distorted. The air was heavy, denser than before, and with every breath I took, I felt as if I were being pulled into something much larger, much older than anything I could imagine. I looked at the walls, and they seemed to breathe, as if they were alive. The wood creaked, the floor stretched and contracted, as if the hotel were an entity with its own mind, a mind that was starting to comprehend what I had done. I had broken the key. I had interrupted the cycle. But with that, I had opened a door to something I wasn't prepared to face. I didn't know where I was going. My legs were heavy, my body tired, but my mind was alert, more alive than ever. Every step I took seemed to pull me deeper, as if I were descending into an abyss with no end. The fear had turned into a constant feeling of urgency. I didn't know how much time I had left. Then I saw something. It was a faint light, but I knew it was real. As I approached, I realized it wasn't a lamp, not a regular light source. It was a door I hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows, almost like it had been waiting for me. I touched it, and the doorknob felt warmer than it should have, as if it was in contact with some invisible energy. With a sigh, I opened it. What was behind the door wasn't what I expected. It wasn't an exit. It was an empty room, but at the same time, it wasn't empty. The space was full of something. Something I couldn't see, but that I felt in every fiber of my being. The air was thick, and the sensation of being watched was almost tangible. Suddenly, a voice, not the same as before, but a new one, deep and ancient, rang out in the silence. "You can't escape." The room lit up then, but not comfortably. It was a cold light, coming from all directions, a light that didn't cast shadows. And that's when I saw it. In the center of the room, there was a figure. It was human, but not quite. Its body was deformed, its skin pale and stretched, the eyes. There were no eyes, just empty holes. It stood there, motionless, but its presence was overwhelming. The air around me grew even thicker, as if it was sucking all the energy from the space. "You broke the rules," the voice said again, coming from inside my head. Now the price will be paid. I wanted to run. I wanted to go back to the door and get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped there, facing the entity that didn't seem human, but that was looking at me with a distant curiosity, as if it were studying my soul. You thought you could interrupt the cycle, but the cycle is not something that can be broken. It always returns. The voice echoed, reverberating inside me. The feeling of terror took over my entire being. I knew I was facing something beyond anything I had ever experienced, something that couldn't be rationalized, that had no explanation. "Now you'll be part of it," the voice said, and then a low, cruel laugh followed, filling the space like thunder. "You didn't escape, you only became part of the process." The price, always the price. I couldn't understand what was happening. I didn't know what to do. The being in front of me wasn't a man. It wasn't an entity. It was something that existed beyond comprehension. It wasn't the hotel. It was the reason the hotel existed. And now it was watching me, waiting, like a predator who knows the prey is about to become part of it. The pressure in my chest increased. I felt like I was being crushed, and yet there was no movement, nothing I could do to free myself. The room seemed to be closing in, as if the space itself was trying to swallow me. And then, in a final desperate effort, a memory came to my mind. I didn't know where it came from, but it was there. The name. A name I hadn't remembered until that moment. I screamed. But the sound wasn't mine. It was the name of the hotel. I screamed the name of its essence, the name it refused to forget, the name that made the cycle continue. And when the words left my mouth, a wave of light exploded from the figure in front of me, and the pressure in my chest disappeared. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but the entity didn't disappear. It just stayed there, watching. "Now you understand. The price was never for you. The price is for everyone who enters here." I woke up. But it wasn't a true awakening. I was lying on the floor of that empty room, unsure if what I had seen was real or an illusion produced by my mind. But the weight on my soul wouldn't let me doubt. Something had changed. Something inside me had broken, and now I was irreversibly tied to whatever that place was, to that cycle. I stood up, my legs trembling, and took a hesitant step toward the door. There was no longer the sensation of being watched, but the emptiness, the deafening silence, made me feel like something was waiting. Something invisible, something much older than I could comprehend. The hallway was different, distorted. The walls seemed closer, as if the hotel had shrunk around me. The lighting was low, a faint light that didn't seem natural. And the sound was the same. The creak of the wooden boards, the sigh of the old structure, as if the building itself was breathing, sighing, living. When I reached the reception desk, the clock on the wall was showing the same time. The same damn hour. 3:30 in the morning. The moment I knew the entity would take control, when the cycle would start again, and no one would ever escape. But there was something else. On top of the counter, a key was shining under the light, a key that shouldn't have been there. It had a peculiar shape different from all the others, and the glow on it seemed inviting, as if I had to take it. Something inside me knew that this key represented more than just an object, but I couldn't resist. I picked it up. It was the worst mistake of my life. The key felt cold, too cold, as if it was carrying the weight of decades of suffering. And then I knew. I knew that this key wasn't for liberation. It wouldn't open the exit door. It would open the door to something even more terrifying. I looked at the front door, the glass reflecting my image, a sweaty, disheveled man with empty eyes, as if I had lost my soul a long time ago. An expression that wasn't mine, but that had formed over the course of days, weeks, or maybe years. I no longer knew. I knew there would be no escape. The price, as that voice said, was for everyone who entered. But now I was part of it. I was no longer just a receptionist, no longer a human being. I was part of the hotel. The cycle wouldn't end with me, but I would be part of it. I let the key drop onto the counter. It made a metallic sound when it hit the wooden surface, and the echo was so deep, it seemed to reverberate in every wall of the hotel. The sound spread like a wave, rippling, dragging something heavy and inevitable. And then I heard it. The familiar sound of footsteps. Footsteps that weren't mine. Footsteps that didn't belong to anyone else. The same sound I had heard on the first night. Footsteps coming from inside the hotel, from a room that should never have been opened, coming from something that had been waiting for me. I saw nothing else. The last image I had was the reflection in the glass door. My eyes were now empty, lifeless, soulless. And as the echo of the footsteps grew louder, I knew the cycle had begun again. The hotel had consumed me, and now I was the next presence to be felt, the next entity that would haunt that place. And in the depths of my mind, a final, terrifying truth formed. No receptionist would last more than one shift.